One day, after a busy work schedule, I prepared to take the last order. When I got the order, I realized I didn't recognize the address. A single order had been placed to a house in a neighborhood I had never been to before, amidst labyrinthine streets. I put the pizzas in my car and headed for that address. When I arrived in the neighborhood, I felt lost in the surrounding fog. My GPS kept malfunctioning, and I was trying to find the address by wandering from street to street. Finally, I stopped in front of an old, spooky-looking house. The door of the house was half open, all its windows were broken, and its garden was covered with weeds. I hesitated for a moment, thinking, who could possibly order pizza from this house? But due to my job, I had to deliver the pizzas. I got out of my car and walked towards the door. I stood in front of the door and rang the bell, but it didn't work. I gently knocked on the door and shouted, "Pizza delivery!" After waiting a few seconds, I heard a faint footstep from inside. In front of the door appeared an old woman with white hair and deep wrinkles, holding a torch. Her eyes pierced through me. "You brought my order, I guess?" she said. "Yes," I replied with a shaky voice, and handed her the pizzas. She looked at me and said, "No one has lived in this house for years. I live here alone. I don't know who ordered the pizza, but since you brought it, come in and leave it." In fear, I replied, "No, thank you. I'll just leave it here." But the woman grabbed my arm tightly and pulled me inside. The inside of the house was old and damp. The woman led me to an old living room and said, "Wait." The antique furniture, paintings, and books around me were mesmerizing. However, when I saw a particular painting, I was stunned. In the painting was the old woman I was currently facing, but the date on the painting indicated that it was 150 years old. I didn't know what to do until the woman returned, but with the fear inside me, I ran to the door and rushed out. I jumped into my car and drove away quickly. The next day I told my boss about the incident. He laughed and said, "Oh, that house. It's been abandoned for years. No one lives there." After that day, I never went to that neighborhood again, and I could never forget that terrifying night. That night, my job started with a routine order. However, that special order that came to my phone was going to make the whole night unforgettable. The address pointed to a grand and majestic mansion in one of the most remote corners of the city. I had never delivered an order in such an affluent neighborhood before. I was both curious and apprehensive. When I arrived at the mansion, I passed through its wide gates and entered. I gently knocked on the door. While waiting, I observed the surroundings. Everywhere was dark. Only the spot I stood by the door was lit. Eventually, the door slightly opened, and a middle-aged man in elegant attire stood before me. His eyes were cold, and there was a noticeable weight in his speech. "Did you bring the order?" he asked. I promptly replied, "Yes, it's right here." The man invited me inside. "I'd like you to leave it inside. Follow me," he said. I felt uneasy, but it didn't seem like I had a choice. The house was much larger and more maze-like than I had expected. The walls were adorned with old family portraits, dark wood panels, and red carpets. The man led me to a room deep inside. As we entered the room, all the men sitting at tables, dressed in suits and ties, looked at me. In the center of a table was a large map with various documents on it. I instantly realized this was no ordinary home. The man said, "Leave the order here." Shaking, I placed the order on the table. At that moment, a noise echoed within the house. Everyone stood up. The door swiftly opened, and several masked individuals rushed in. Everyone drew their weapons. In panic, I shouted, "I just brought food!" One of the masked men said, "Don't worry, we're the police," and pulled me to a corner for protection. The masked men clarified that they were indeed the police and had come for a raid. After experiencing one of the most terrifying moments of my life, the police escorted me to a safe place. From that day on, I quit my delivery job. Now, every time I see a delivery app, I'm reminded of that dreadful night. Once upon a time in my youth, I worked at a pizzeria on the outskirts of the city. I don't remember most of the orders, but one of them was unforgettable for me. One evening, the phone at work rang, and the voice on the other end sounded like an old woman. "A large margarita, please," she said. When she gave the address, she described an old neighborhood in the most remote corner of the city, a place I had never been before. It was late in the evening, and going to that side of the city was always a bit eerie. We prepared the pizza, and I set off on my motorcycle. The destination was at the end of a dark street. A large, old, and nearly dilapidated house. The garden was unkempt, and high walls surrounding the house prevented me from seeing inside. I stopped in front of the door and rang the bell. The door was open, and there was a note stuck to it. The note said, "Leave the pizza on the table." This situation unnerved me a bit, but I still followed the instructions on the note. The inside of the house was cold and dark, with old furniture and faded pictures on the walls. After leaving the pizza, I wanted to get out of there immediately. However, as I headed towards the exit, I heard a faint singing sound coming from above. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved towards the source of the sound. When I went upstairs, I saw an old woman singing to herself. Her face wasn't turned towards me, and when she turned around, I noticed her face was a white mask. I was frozen in fear. The woman whispered, "Where's the pizza?" "I left it downstairs," I replied, trembling. At that moment, I noticed other masked figures around the woman that I hadn't seen before. I ran swiftly down the stairs, jumped onto my motorcycle, and sped away as fast as I could. The next day, I told my boss about my experience. He told me that nobody had lived at that address for years, and that the house was abandoned. From that day on, I never went back to that neighborhood, and every time I passed by that house, I would get goosebumps.